This is Open Studio, a podcast where I invite artists that I know and admire to join me for unfiltered conversations about all things creative. I'm really excited about this week's episode. I had the chance to speak with Jess Currier. She's an incredible painter based out of Los Angeles, and I was honored that she took the time out of her schedule to speak to me on the podcast. We had a really great conversation, and I'm excited to finally share it all with you. Please go and support her and check out her work. I'll leave links in the description of this video. Also, if you haven't already, please go and check out my Patreon page. It's a great way to stay connected with everything that I'm working on, and a subscription even in the smallest amount makes a huge difference to me. With that, let's get into it. So Jess, thank you so much, first of all, for agreeing to join me on the podcast and chat with me. I'm really excited to... Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to get into some stuff with you. I guess just to start, because I don't know you that well, I would love to hear a little bit more about like your creative origins. And maybe, I don't know, at what point in your life you felt like you identified as an artist or a creative person, and maybe like what that journey has been like for you.
I love that question. I have a little bit of a different story, I guess, in that I never have memories of not wanting to be an artist. Like, as long as I can remember from when I was a tiny child, I just kind of knew that I wanted to make things. And some of my earliest memories are like when I was 4 or 5, I would take my Barbies and like clear out my bookshelves and build apartments for them, like in the bookshelves, or like take like random fabric scraps and leaves and shit and like make them clothes. Like I was just always making things. And I think I sort of just knew like that a creative life was what I was meant for. The funny thing is that it took me a very long time to come to painting. I think in adolescence and as I got older and I kind of saw what was out there, I knew I wanted to be a sort of traditional fine artist, whatever that means. I knew I wanted to paint, but I really loved it, and I really didn't want to be bad at it. So that perfectionism and the sort of perception of identity that was wrapped up in it really paralyzed me from trying. I had really, at the time, bought into this sort of myth of talent, that creativity is just for the chosen prodigies. It's just for the ones who, are born with it. You just innately have these abilities because that's sort of what culture tells us. And when you aren't exposed to the process and to working artists, when you don't have too much exposure to that, which I think a lot of people don't growing up, you kind of buy into this myth that like, oh, if I'm not automatically good at it, I must not have it, whatever it is. And that kept me doing other creative things for a long time. So I did photography, I did design, I consulted doing art direction and environmental branding, all sorts of stuff. I'm really grateful for those detours now because they've really served me well in running an art business. But they were all different versions of me running away from my fear of being a bad painter.
That is such a relatable sentiment. And I think it's also like, I feel like a lot of creative people like run into that at some point where like the perfectionism and this expectation of wanting to be good actually like it definitely inhibited me from even trying or like making mistakes and being willing to fail and learn and get better. I wonder what was the turning point for you? When did you overcome that fear?
So I was doing photography and I was getting quite busy with it, and the business was starting to become successful. And I kind of realized I hated it. I was like, this is not for me. This is not my this is not my thing. I wanted to be working with my hands. I wanted to be physically making things. And I sort of had this, like tough, fork in the road moment conversation with myself, where I was like, do I want to be doing this, for the next few years? Do I see myself doing this? And so at that point I went, back to school. I finished college. I studied painting, and I started to slowly transition, and ended up, through a series of random life events, getting some work doing design. Started making good money doing that. And again, kind of like pivoted, sort of fell into this other business opportunity. And I ended up losing my job in design. So I had gotten a full-time job. I was making great money doing it. And they cut some positions. The company cut positions, and I ended up losing my job. And I had found myself in this moment where I was like, oh, here, I recognize this place. I've been here before. Do I want to continue doing the safe, creative work that it feels like less of a risk because I don't care about it as much? I could start doing this freelance. I could continue the design work. It was going well, but I knew I didn't love it like I loved painting. I wasn't scared to do it like I was scared to paint. But thankfully, at this point, I was a little older, a little more experienced, and I think I had the confidence and the wisdom at that stage of my life to recognize that I would rather be a bad painter than not be a painter at all.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that's when I went back for my MFA. I kind of dove into painting full force, and that happened slowly. I think when we tell these stories, it's easy for it to come across like I had this epiphany moment, which I did, but then I took the next 3 years, working my way through grad school, doing design part-time, and slowly starting to paint more and sell paintings and get good at it, develop my voice as an artist, all these things.
Yeah.
To, 6 years later, here I am now. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process full of daily decisions to reorient my life around art. And I'm really glad I did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like I'm very similar in the sense that like I always knew that I wanted to do something creative with my life. I found painting much later in my life, but I think like finally being able to make that decision and really take the leap and say, you know what, this is what I love and this is what makes me the happiest, and so I'm going to pursue it regardless of, how, absurd or difficult it might be. It's a really good feeling. And it's, I don't know, like for me that kind of like coming back to myself in a way through painting allowed me to just feel more confident generally in my life as well, and like feel motivated. It's like I feel I've never lost the momentum or the motivation with painting like I have with other things, just because I'm like, it makes sense, like this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
I feel that way too.
And I think also something you said about, I think that's such a good point, that it does happen slowly. It's not like something that all of a sudden overnight, you're like working a regular job and then the next morning you're a full-time painter. Like it takes a lot of transitioning and steps forward, steps backward. And also like all of those years for me of like not painting full-time and doing it on the side, those were really important too. Like that was actually part of the decision ultimately, because it taught me how much I hated, working in a film production team or in a marketing team or whatever. And like, that's actually a big part of it in a way, is like having those, I don't want to say necessarily like negative experiences, but like experiences that shifted my mindset and allowed me to see what I really wanted to prioritize in my life.
That's exactly it. Because it's not like those things are bad. It's so contextual, right? Like you have to go through the process of learning what's not aligned for you in order to know what is a lot of the time. Yeah, like you have to try other things and recognize like, oh, this doesn't feel how painting feels. And for someone else, that might be the thing, production or film or whatever, photography, like might be the thing that sparks something in them and makes them feel alive, and they keep that motivation with it and they fall in love with it. But if that's not how it makes you feel, then you don't have to do it. You can do
No, you don't.
what does make you come alive and makes you feel that way. And I think I also kind of had to come around to this idea that like the world is going to be better for it the more people that do that. Like when you are doing what keeps you most engaged and present and alive, you're happier, you're a better human, your impact will be larger with your work. And there's a ripple effect to that I think is hugely positive. And I wish we talked about that more. Like, it's okay if something that other people love is not a right fit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was even talking to one of my friends about this last night. Like, it makes me really sad when I meet creative people or hear of creative people who like are really passionate about some medium and like are obsessed with it on the same level that I'm obsessed with painting, but like just can't make it work for themselves, like whether it's a financial issue or circumstantial in their life. And like that's to me is really sad that, you know, just because of some like something that's out of your control, you can't always take that leap and make the decision to do what you love. And then, you know, like at the end of the day, I agree with you that like, you know, they are probably not going to be the best version of themselves, and then also the best version of their community or their family or their friend group or whatever, because they're unable to do what they really want to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh man, sad to think about. You mentioned the feeling of painting doesn't feel like anything else in your life. Can you describe what like painting feels like to you, or is that too abstract?
Oh no, I mean, it's gonna sound a little fluffy because it is so abstract. It's so about the feeling that I could talk about it all day. So I love that question. To me, there's something like, just for me, there's something uniquely magic about painting because, you know, it's been often described as alchemy, this sort of seemingly magical, transformative process where you are taking pretty basic materials. It's dirt, it's pigment, it's just, it's earth, minerals, like dirt and oil, and you're rubbing it around on a piece of cloth. Like, and yet no one who's stood in front of a painting can say, oh, that just looks like dirt. I don't know, maybe for some art, that's like the intention. I think for the most part, everyone who's experienced art can acknowledge that it becomes something so much more. It's transcendent. It's something that like touches you on a soul level. And I think all art has the capacity to connect us to ourselves and to each other. And whether you're the creator or you're the one engaging it holds space for the full spectrum of the human experience and our emotional experience. And I love painting because I think it's one of the most tactile, immersive ways of participating in that creative process. It's sort of, uniquely hands-on and tactile, and different from sculpture or ceramics. You're still creating a two-dimensional image, which has there's just unlimited potential for what that could be. So I love that part of it too. Like it could be anything, no two painters paint exactly the same. They're like just the potential for the diversity and the full spectrum of what images can look like, but you're still creating it with your hands. You're still leaving your mark. A brush stroke, a mark is a recording of your movement in a moment. And you can't create a painting without having a sort of recording of the artist's hands. Like you're recording the movements of your hands. And that's so human. That's so basic. And to me, there's something that feels just timeless and magical about that you don't get, at least that I don't feel when it comes to other mediums. And I sort of just fell in love with painting. And I always have, even before I was painting myself. I would look at paintings, and it was that element of it, the fact that I could see the materiality of it. I could see the ingredients up close. You can see the pigment, the way it's set, the material is set on the canvas. You can see the mark of the artist's hands, the evidence of their movement, of their intent. And then you step back and it's transforms into a recognizable image that tells a whole story. And there's just so much richness there. And I've always just been completely enamored and captivated by painting. I still am. I still feel that way. After doing
it doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away. And my God, like how lucky are we that it doesn't go away? That's incredible.
Absolutely. And that's a fear that I had at some point, is like, if I do too much of this, I will lose the love that I have for it, or the joy that it makes me feel. And like, that was something I was pretty terrified of. And luckily it hasn't happened. And so I hope it doesn't. That was so beautifully said. Oh my gosh. I really resonate with that idea of just the immediacy of painting too. Like when you're standing in front of a painting that someone else created, like you are in the same position that the painter was in, looking at the same surface that they were looking at. And it almost to me feels like time traveling in a way, where it's like an encapsulation of whatever period of time they spent working on it, like frozen for you to experience as well. And I think that's also why for me, like, paintings are some of the only pieces of art. I mean, there's definitely other stuff as well, but painting more than anything for me, that I will like stand in front of a painting for a long time appreciating it, because I almost feel like I need to, in order to really appreciate it, you have to give it time, because the artist gave it time as well. And for me, like that relationship between painting and time, it's just so, I don't know, I think about it a lot. It's so interesting.
I love that. I haven't thought of it that way before, but it makes so much sense that, like, yeah, because it brings me back to that idea of brushwork as recorded movement. Like the artist, like every single stroke is intentional. It carries the artist's intent and their time, like their presence. And I think that's also why I always come back to painting, is that I feel so present and awake to the moment as I'm doing it. You can't be checked out, especially with the work that I do. It's quite technical, and so I have to be fully present in every part of the process. And I think that when that's the case, the work, like the end product, carries that energy, and people can feel it when they stand in front of it. And that still feels like magic to me.
It is magic. It's such an intangible thing that, like, I don't think anyone will ever be able to describe it necessarily, but it really does feel like magic to, like, stand in front of an incredible painting and, like, yeah, feel the person who made it in the painting. I wanted to touch on, you mentioned storytelling in painting, and like at least the work that I've seen of yours to me feels very narrative. And I wonder if that's something that's like intentional for you, or something that you stumbled into, this idea of trying to tell a story through painting.
So it's kind of funny that you ask that, because it very much was not intentional. It was very much something I stumbled into, and not even stumbled into, but I think ran into me. I, in my experience, have found that you really can't lie to art. You can't lie to your work. whatever you are processing and filtering and experiencing as a human will come out in what you make. And I think that's also part of the magic. That's what makes art so special, is it is about your unique filter of your experience and your voice and what you're expressing and processing. And then it carries that and people can connect to it, like we've been talking about. So when I started painting the beginning iterations of the work I do now, which you can kind of see them all around me. And if you see my work on my website or Instagram, you can see I do these large scale kind of double exposure style images of florals and foliage overlaid on figures and faces. And this is my big work. This is the work I see myself doing for the foreseeable future. It's kind of become my signature style. And like with a lot of things, social media kind of gives you this picture of oh, here's this put together body of work. It's all cohesive, and this is where this artist, this is what this artist makes. When the reality is, I got there through a very winding path of doing little floral studies and portraits and quick expressive, studies, and it all sort of led me here. And the interesting thing is that it's become this very autobiographical expression. The story that I think these paintings are telling is really the story of my life and my own journey, and the sort of mindsets that I have towards life now. That's very much what I'm painting about. But I didn't realize that until I painted it. I painted it first, and then I figured out how to talk about it with words, which I think a lot of artists can relate to.
Absolutely.
If I could articulate it with words, I wouldn't need to paint it. I had to paint it first.
Exactly.
And so the narrative for these pieces now is really, it's about holding space for the full spectrum of our emotional experience as humans, for the grief and the loss and despair and hope and beauty and joy. And flowers are containers for that spectrum. We have sort of embraced them as something that holds our emotions, right? We use them in our moments of deepest grief and greatest joy. We place them at altars for weddings, and we lay them at graves, at funerals. They're what you bring when someone loses someone or has a baby or gets married. All of these, the spectrum of our experience and our emotional experience as humans, we've sort of used flowers to as a container for that. We've embodied them with that meaning. And I think because they are inherently transient, they are alive. They don't stay alive, they die. You can't keep them, but they are miraculously beautiful and not very utilitarian for us. They have no, sort of practical purpose for humans that, obviously they have a place in the ecosystem, but that's a separate thing. We don't use them in a utilitarian way. We use them to mark meaning, and not just for happy moments, but for the hard ones too. And I think that's why I keep coming back to flowers, because to me, they're this act of brave rebellion that says, even in the face of loss and despair and this sort of existential dread of impermanence, look at this beauty. It matters. And that's such a brave thing to do. I think that's the bravest thing anyone can do, is to to choose to still show up for their life, to remain awake to this sort of paradox of suffering and beauty that we all face. And that's why, you know, the layers are sheer. It's fleeting, it's intangible. You can't keep it or hold on to it. But you still choose to see it and show up for it and keep going, which has very much been my own story, my own journey. And I think I started painting about that while I was still in it. And now I'm sort of tracing the breadcrumbs and seeing the pattern.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely relate to that experience of, you know, like a painting or a piece of art revealing something about my own emotional state or some experience that I've gone through that I actually am not like consciously aware of. I love that sentiment, that idea of like flowers being containers for the whole spectrum of human emotions. It's such a beautiful idea. And I also kind of see a parallel between the way that you're describing flowers and how they are kind of transient and fleeting, but they're brave in the sense that they are saying, we are going to be here, we're going to be beautiful. Like, even though we know it's not infinite. And that and painting in a way, like the act of painting to me is very similar, right? Where it's like, look, this is not practical. You can't eat this thing that I'm making, but it's going to be beautiful and I'm going to do it anyway. And it's like a celebration of life. And I think, I don't know if that's something you've thought about as well, but like that, I like kind of the combination of that sentiment with the floral symbol. And then also in the actual act of you painting, it's almost like reaffirming that same message in a way.
It totally is. I love that. And I've definitely thought about the connection there of just like, because I had to come to a place of acceptance around art as a viable, like worthwhile career or like life, like a use of my life. I grew up in a very rigid religious environment. And there was sort of this, you know, spoken and unspoken idea that you really needed to like save the world with your work. Like if you were supposed to use your life to do something that was in service of others, which I think is a beautiful sentiment at its core, but the way that was defined was quite narrow. And I really had to unpack that and come to a place of recognition that, you know, painting did serve the world and it served me because I loved it and other people love it. And it does matter and it doesn't need to be, you can't eat it. Like it doesn't need to be practical for it to be meaningful, you know? Utility and meaning are not mutually exclusive. They're not one and the same. You don't, you know. And that the beauty itself can be extremely meaningful and can be of service to the world.
Yeah, it's essential. And at least in my opinion, it's something that's necessary because like, we are biological creatures and we, you know, require sustenance and all of the things that keep us being alive. But we're also something else outside of that. And I think part of what makes us human is this capacity for self-awareness and thought and reflection and introspection. And all of those things are like, I don't know, reaffirmed by the act of making a piece of art to me. And it's kind of like, in a way, the most human thing you can do is to say, look, yeah, I am an animal on some level, but I'm also more than that. And I'm going to purposely put my time and energy and resources into doing something that is not going to sustain me like on a physical level, but is still like essential to me as a human being and to other human beings because we all share that.
And it is, it's funny that you bring that up. I've been thinking lately, the more I learn about biology and psychology and the science of, you know, what makes us tick as humans, the more I come back to this idea that creativity is the thing that makes the most sense to me, because it's the thing that remains sacred and transcendent and separate. Like, it is so uniquely human. It, in some ways, doesn't make sense because it doesn't sustain our survival directly. It's how we create meaning. It's how we process our experiences. It's how we connect to others and to ourselves, and that, like, that's so unique to humans. And I think that centering that is it's one of the most beautiful ways to live your life, to create meaning in life, is to engage with creativity, whether you're the one making things or you're just participating and interacting with them. Yeah, love that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also think, like, I really do believe that most humans have some kind of inclination towards being creative and imaginative. Yeah, and I think especially, like, if you spend time around kids at all, like, you notice how imaginative they are. And, like, I even, when I was a kid, I feel like I was making up worlds and, like, could just, like, live in a total make-believe state and just believe that it was reality, because I was, like, that able to just be creative and free and not, like, bound by the constraints of, like, living in society, let's say. But I do think all of us have that. Yeah. And then it kind of gets sucked out of people, or it gets, like, taught out of people, right? And, like, then all of a sudden it becomes almost taboo, especially in certain parts of the world and certain cultures. And it's, like, really something that is looked down on, or not necessarily, like, looked down on maybe, but more like something that is non-essential. And it's like, oh, this is not, like, a smart or good thing to do with your life necessarily. And that's, like, I don't know, it's strange to me. It seems backwards. Like, it should be the opposite, maybe.
I think so too. I think it is backwards. And, it makes sense because that sort of expression doesn't fit within a lot of the structures we have, right? Like, things go smoothly when everyone kind of, like, toes the line and does the same thing, and you check the boxes and just follow the prescribed path. And to deviate from that makes people really uncomfortable. And it's scary to do. It's scary to live counterculturally or differently. But that's also why that's a big part of what motivates me to keep painting, honestly, is this idea that, my life can serve as a kind of beacon to light a path to show others what's possible for them. Not to do the type of work I do necessarily, but just to recognize that, they can live a creative life, that they can find their own voice. And I really didn't have too many examples of that growing up, especially women. And I always come back to that because I'm like, oh man, what if I had gotten to see that? What if I had those examples, those luminaries, like, ahead of me? And I could have seen what it was like to go your own way and live a creative life. And thankfully I have that now. And that's one beautiful thing about the sort of pervasive nature of social media and the internet, is that there's an unlimited, resource of these beautiful examples that you can find. And I think every person who is putting their work out into the world, who is creating, who is living differently and sharing it, is participating in that change of being an example of what's possible for the next generation.
Yeah. I oh my gosh, absolutely. I think it's so important, and I hope that more people keep doing it, because, like, I know especially when I started painting, I didn't really, maybe it was also circumstantial, like, it was people where I was living and who I was around, but I did not have those, like, figures in my life that I could look to and say, this person made a choice to live creatively or be an artist or do something a little bit different with their life. And I think if I had, I probably would have started painting a lot earlier. Like and it's like nice to like, I don't know, have, it's almost like a validation of like how I felt and how I always like the way that I wanted to live my life. If I had had someone like that, it would have validated that feeling, made me feel a little bit more included, which I think is really important.
It also breaks down that myth, right? That it's like only for that you have to have it all figured out, or it's only for the chosen talented ones, because you see into the process more.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I'm honestly trying to do more of, like in the near future, is just be like really a little bit more vulnerable and honest about like the reality of being an artist and like trying to make it work, and the ups and also the downs. Because I think like, social media, it's really easy to portray a certain version of my life and what I'm doing. And like the reality is not apparent all the time. And I also think it's helpful for people to understand maybe some of the challenges sometimes, and like have a real honest representation of somebody trying to make it work as an artist. Because I don't know, there's also, in the same way that it is important to have those people, those beacons to build you up, there can be too much of it, and it can be almost like toxically positive sometimes. And I think like the reality is also something that people need to hear. At least I would like to hear.
Oh yeah, well, because you're only seeing these highlight reels, these like polished portfolios. You're seeing the tip of this iceberg, the top of the mountain moments, because that's the nature of the internet and social media. And I could not agree more. And I have very much, from the beginning when I started showing up on Instagram, I think because I was at a point where I was like, I'm gonna be a bad artist. Like that was kind of how I started. I was like, I'm gonna make shitty work that I don't feel great about and share it anyway, and I'm going to commit to that. And I've talked about that at different points, and I've sort of pulled back the curtain a little bit, or at least tried to, on the ups and the downs of what it's like to be committed to a sustained creative practice. And I couldn't agree more. I think what we've talked about so far is like a lot of the like alchemy and the magic and this transcendence and all these beautiful things, but which makes it sound really like we're just like happy, joyful, like, fairy artists floating around in the studio making things, and everything turns out great all the time. And we both know that that's definitely not it. What are if I could ask you, what are some of those like darker, like harder, more difficult things that you wish you saw, or that you feel like drawn to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, honestly, right now in my life, I think one of the biggest ones is kind of like the added pressure of like having somewhat of a following on social media, and also the added pressure of being reliant on painting to make a living. And like, especially with the way that I approach painting and like kind of my philosophy about like I prefer not to go to galleries. I prefer to do shows like in local venues, because I want it to be community oriented. And I also have like a pretty low price structure that I'm sticking to and not planning on changing, because I purposely want my art to be as accessible as possible. I don't want to like price people out necessarily. But as a result of that, like right now, there's been like a couple tough months of me like not really making enough money to survive. And that's also like partially because like, it's when all of a sudden there's people watching, and there's like, you have a bunch of followers or people who are expecting something out of you. Like sometimes I feel like now I'm doing things because I feel like that's what people expect, as opposed to like experimenting in the way that I would like to be experimenting, or like taking a new direction in the way that I would like to be. And like ordinarily I wouldn't care, actually. Like I don't think I'm like, the validation is not that significant to me, but because I need the money and I need to sustain some kind of financial element, I'm like, well, shit, I kind of have to play into this. Right. Whereas like if I didn't worry about if the money was not an issue, I would experiment even if people didn't like what I was doing. It's fine. Like that's kind of part of the process for me. But yeah, kind of trying that balance. I don't know if I articulated it well, but that balance has been a tough one. Yeah.
It's so hard because you're essentially taking something that I think, like we've touched on a lot so far, is inherent to our humanity. It's very natural to create. And then you're trying to operate within these really rigid structures of like capitalism and like commercial realities and having to pay your bills and run a business. And those are really different things. And there is so much tension that arises when you find that overlap of like business and marketing and creativity, and trying to fit your creativity and hold that tension between, you know, the realities of needing to sustain your life in the society we live in and within those structures, and operate within creative integrity. And there are going to be times where those are just inherently at odds with one another. And I think every artist can probably relate to that experience of, you know, what works commercially is not what you feel, you know, inspired towards.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
It's actually quite rare that they're aligned. And I think navigating that spectrum, and that's kind of what's helped me, is seeing it as a spectrum of, as an artist, I'm going to exist on this continuum of, you know, commercial viability and, you know, inspired integrity and creativity. And sometimes I'll be able to balance both sides, or like lean a little bit more this way. And sometimes I'll have to pivot and move back over here to like pay my rent this month. And I think that's always going to be part of the journey. And of course, the goal for every artist is to like combine those two as much as possible. But I think it's okay to recognize and to like hold space for like, no, sometimes these aren't aligned. Oftentimes they're not. And kind of normalizing that. Because I think on social media, the tendency is to be like, you know, if you have a following, there's sort of this assumption that you've figured out how to perfectly balance both. And that's just not true.
Yeah. And that's also can be really negative, actually, when people like, you know, they see you as successful because of, you know, some superficial number or like the way that you've presented yourself. And then all of a sudden, like sometimes people are like, oh, well, this person, I'm not going to buy a painting. They don't need the help in a way. I don't know. It's like there's this other attitude of like how people approach you all of a sudden.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. I guess you're like, you said you've been doing this 6 years now, right? I guess you're like a little bit further along in terms of.
So I started in 2017 is when I started sharing my work on Instagram. I went back to school for my MFA, and I during that time was working doing freelance design consulting, so taking different projects, doing environmental branding and art direction. And I did that freelance work up until 2021 sort of faded out at that point. And I started selling small paintings for real cheap, mostly through Instagram DMs in like 2018. And so I sold at like craft fairs and stuff like that a little bit before then. In 2017, I took a lot of commissions. I did a lot of random projects, but it was really this sort of puzzle of a lot of different moving parts. And it still is. So my Instagram kind of grew exponentially in 2021 and 2022, really expanded. which did bring a lot of opportunities, but kind of like you said, not as much as people think. Like a large following doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean anything. Like it just means you have a lot of social media followers, and that can be leveraged towards opportunity, but it doesn't happen by itself. You still have to do the work. And I think too, I also appreciate when people are honest about that. Like I still teach workshops and take some consulting gigs here and there. And yes, I sell originals, and yes, like I'm launching prints soon. And I'm able to do that in large part because I've built this strong online community. I would say not even so much because of the large following, but because of the core following of kind of kindred spirits and like-minded creative people who really resonate with my work, and I resonate with them. Like there's a really beautiful mutuality of that, but I love my online community genuinely. And if, my following disappeared and it just dwindled down to like those core people, I think I would still have a sustainable art career, and it would still contribute to that. So it's not about the number. Like that just gives you a lot of opportunity for people to see your work, and that is important. But you still it doesn't make you that different than someone with a smaller following. Like it's not an accurate reflection of someone's career success or business. It's just social media.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm glad that we're saying this, honestly, because I don't think a lot of people talk about that, at least like is very openly, and especially people who do have like a high follower count and are perceived as successful. I almost feel like some people get to that point and they're like, oh, I have to keep the secret in a way, and like I don't like that attitude about it.
It's scary to be like, I'm not as successful as it looks like I am.
For
That's
sure.
essentially what I'm saying. Like this isn't the glamorous thing you think it is. It isn't. Like,
no, it's definitely not. Yeah.
Right.
But I think like for me, one of the positive aspects of recognizing that is that now I'm like honestly trying to put a lot more energy into other ways of reaching people, and especially doing stuff like locally here in Prague, and like trying to promote my art in a way that feels a little bit more sustainable. Like you're talking about having, this core group, like the people who are going to be there even if you deleted your Instagram account. And like that's something that I'm starting to put more energy into, and it feels really, really good. It's really fulfilling. To me, there's like I prefer that experience too of like, interacting with another person face to face. Like, and even if they don't buy a painting, just like getting like to stand next to someone while they're looking at one of my paintings and talk to them about it. Or like if someone asks for a commission, I can go and get a coffee with them and like actually speak to them and meet them as a human being. Like for me, that like adds another level of depth, or like even some of that magic too, right? Because then all of a sudden, like the thing you're making is being shared very organically with another person. And that to me is like something that I'm putting more and more of myself into that direction.
Yeah, I'm doing the same, because I think you hit it exactly. It's the magic of art. If the magic of art is the way that it connects us to ourselves and other people to themselves and us to each other, right? Like it's that shared experience and the container for our emotions and all of those things. Social media and the internet really robs us of getting to enjoy that part of the creative process, because it essentially divorces you from getting to engage with it. It's that sort of third space of, okay, like I'm going to put this on a screen, and then you're going to look at it on the screen, and I don't get to see a reaction, and we don't get to talk unless you leave a comment. And even then it's so one way, like it's so separate. And getting to, stand in that room in front of an artwork with someone experiencing it is so different. Even them getting to just experience it in person and see art in real life, like with their eyes, not through a screen, is obviously such a different experience. And I think it's so much richer and more rewarding. And I think there's going to be a big movement back towards that.
Yes, I hope so, and I also really believe that it will happen. And like it seems to me, honestly, like the more conversations that I'm having through this podcast and also just in my own private life, like with creative people, there seems to be a similarity, which is that everyone is feeling that impulse and recognizing like how much social media kind of flattens the experience of sharing what you've made, and also flattens the experience of interacting with somebody else about what you've made.
That's a good way to put it. It flattens it. It totally does.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me. I mean, it feels kind of flatter. But it makes like it's invigorating to me to talk to so many people who agree with that and are like, okay, like, well, fuck, let's do something here. Let's make something happen in real life, right? And like, I think that's a really positive change that I hope will become more prevalent. And also, this is something that like I've started kind of saying a little bit more to like people who ask me like for advice if they're like just starting out as artists or something like that. And like I like one of the things I do say now is like, well, also don't necessarily just look at Instagram as your only option for putting yourself out there and promoting yourself and making a career out of this. Like go to your local coffee shop and go and hang up some paintings. Like I guarantee if you might have to go to 4 or 5 places, but one of them will say yes. And then all of a sudden, like, you know, even if just one person comes in and like says, hey, is this yours? I really like it. That's already a more fulfilling experience than getting, you know, 20 comments on an Instagram post. And then also you're building something like you're building a network that is like way more reachable in the sense that like you live in a shared space. And so whatever kind of like relationship you build with the people who come in and see your art, all of a sudden they're like a phone call away or, you know, like a tram ride away or whatever. And that to me feels way more like community building as opposed to like just building like customers, like, you know, or like a fan base or whatever. And to me, I would much rather be that, build a community, even if it's smaller.
Because the people who like your art, who engage with it, are complex, multifaceted humans. Like, it could, like, they could be other artists, fellow creatives. They could work in a different medium. They could, you know, there's so many other connection points that you just don't know what they are when you're just interacting online. And when you get to interact in real life with people, you're interacting with their whole self, not like a curated part or piece. It's a less fragmented way of engaging with each other that I think results in just much more fruitful, dynamic, and rich results because you're bringing your whole self.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I really agree. I would love to kind of shift gears, if you don't mind, and ask you another question, which is, I'm a self-taught artist, and I never went to art school. I never studied painting or any kind of like visual art in a professional capacity. And I'm always curious to hear what people's experiences are in art school. Because I don't know, I've heard positive things and negative things. And I wonder what your experience was and if you feel like it was worth it, if you feel like you could have done it without it. Yeah, just generally what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's an important one because I would say yes to both. Yes, it was worth it. And yes, I could have done it without it. I both loved my experience and I'm really grateful for it. And formal education is not the path for everyone. I went to Academy of Art University for my master's in fine art in painting. And I chose their program, which I actually did mostly online, which is a whole other question, but that has its pros and cons for sure. But they do a great job, you know, creating an online program. It's as good as it can be online. And then I did it in large part during the pandemic. So it worked out in that sense because I would have had to go online like so many people did anyway. But I chose Academy of Art because they have a really robust traditional painting education. They really focus on technical skill building as a foundation for whatever you want to do, where a lot of MFA programs lean much more conceptual. And because I moved around a lot in my adolescence and early 20s, I sort of had this patchwork undergraduate education, and I technically studied art, but I studied at multiple places, and I felt like I missed out on a lot of those kind of core foundational courses, or at least like a structured, like journey through that. And I felt by the time I graduated undergrad, I was like, I still feel like I don't know how to paint. I don't know what I'm doing. And I was really longing for that kind of traditional atelier style foundation. That's what I knew I needed. I was looking for something that could give me guidance through building the technical skill to do the work that I imagined in my head. And I absolutely found it at Academy of Art. I loved my professors, my peers, the classes. It was a phenomenal education. That being said, an expensive formal education is not the only way to educate yourself. There are so many things out there now that exist on the entire spectrum of if a formal art degree, where you're paying tens of thousands of dollars is on one end, and watching free YouTube videos, all you need is an internet connection. And then there's everything in between. And I think it really just depends on someone's situation. If, going to school is going to bury you in debt and be debilitatingly stressful, no way is it worth it. There are so many other ways to learn those skills and to practice. I would say the most important thing is that you are putting in the work. At the end of the day, that's really what matters, is are you showing up for your studio practice consistently? And getting an MFA, it was great. I had access to wonderful professors. I got excellent feedback. And I'm sure it accelerated my journey in a huge way. However, mostly what did it was that I had this accountability to paint for hundreds of hours and hundreds of paintings, and to show up most days of the week and paint every day. And that's how I got where I am. And so I think as whatever facilitates you doing that is going to get you where you want to be as an artist. And I think that school is just one way of doing that.
It's such a great way to think about it. Just I like this idea of, you have to show up and do the work, and that's how you're going to improve and learn, is just by doing it as often as you can. And if you can motivate yourself to do that, then go for it. But like you're saying, sometimes you need that, the accountability. You need someone to be checking in on you, or you need some external motivation to be there and do the work. But either way, you can get to the same place. And that's, I don't know, I'm always happy to hear that kind of perspective, because I've also heard, people be a little bit like, oh, you need to go to art school, you need to get a classical education. And then I've also heard people be from the opposite perspective, like, don't go to art, stupid, nobody should do it, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think part of it too is...
I disagree with both of them.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And it's also what you're looking for, right? So for you, if you were looking for a really traditional atelier style painting program to learn that skill set, that's an amazing resource. And you found that by going and doing an MFA program. But some people aren't looking for that. Maybe someone else is a more conceptual artist, or someone who's trying to do something a little bit more naive, and they don't feel like they need that technical training. I think that's a big part of it too, is knowing what path you want to go down and what you're really looking for before you make that decision of going to school or not.
Exactly. And it's like that traditional education served the work that I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to paint in a like traditional realist style. At least to some degree. I wanted to be able to paint things that looked real. And I knew that I needed to, like, I couldn't figure out how to do that by myself. and I needed help. And I think I've also bumped into that attitude. I think a lot of people, if they are self-taught, there's this kind of like, I'm better because I'm self-taught. And
sure. Yeah.
I think that's really damaging. I think both are really damaging. I think anytime someone says like, this is the only way, or this is the superior way, that's not helpful, because that's just what worked for you. Like, stop. Like, I think a lot of people, they'll say, oh, you need a traditional education, when really I'm like, that might not be what serves your work. Like, maybe your aesthetic and your voice and your style are going to thrive more without those rules and frameworks. Or like me, maybe that traditional framework and those rules will, free you to be able to create what it is that you imagine, and they're going to serve your work in a really beautiful way. It's not that there's one that's right or wrong. It's just what serves you and your work and your journey and your particular situation. And like, just kind of normalizing that, like, it's all good. It's all an option. It's just what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, though, I will say it's like maybe easier to have that perspective from the other side of it, right? Of like, making art for a little while and looking back and realizing, oh, actually, you could have done it this way. I could have done it this way. But I think, like starting out, when I was starting out, at least, like I felt there was more pressure, I feel like, or I didn't have the nuance to understand, like, oh, I should think about it in terms of what I'm looking for. And so, I wonder if there's some way to like, get that message across to more people that, like, it's important to think about what you're looking for first before you try and make one of those decisions.
And that was one of the advantages of coming to that choice. Like, I chose to go to art school in my late 20s. So I was further along. I had worked in different careers. I had been painting for a little bit. And I had felt the pain points of what I was missing. And that helped me make that decision. And I realized that not everybody has that. And so I do think it's important to have these conversations to get that out there. That, like, it's okay to, take your time to discern that and to figure it out. And I think you're so right. Like, I'm speaking with this like confidence about the nuance of it from total hindsight. Like, years down the line, no way would I have talked about it like this at 25. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know for myself, like when I went to film school to do my BA, I loved film when I entered, and then I left really not liking it anymore because it's like it got too technical and it like a little bit too theoretical as well. And I think it sucked a lot of the joy out of the process of making film. And also writing. Like, both of those things were things that I used to really be like very invested in. And I feel like if it had been the case with painting, I probably would have had a similar experience. Like, I think maybe I would have gone to art school and I would have taken a painting course and then not loved it as much, potentially. I'm not saying that would happen to me now. Like, I think even the point you make about like you can take your time with it. There's no rush, right? But I think like for some people at certain times, like the experience of going to art school could also be negative in that way. Yeah.
I think that's totally the case, which is why it's so important to, I think, these conversations are great because, you know, you're providing people with more tools in their toolkit, with more information of access to someone else's experience who's like a few years down the road. But that is only helpful if you filter it and apply it to your unique situation. And you filter it through the lens of what is it that you want? Because the right or wrongness of any path is contextual to where you want to go, right? Like a route is only successful or like right if it gets you to your destination. And so being able to discern who is it that I want to be? How is it that I want to feel? What do I want to use how do I want to use my life? What is meaningful to me? Like all of those questions are essential to work through. Not that you have to have them figured out, because I don't think anyone totally does, but at least be asking those questions as you're making the decisions of how do you get an education? How do you start a career? Like, what is it that you want to study? Where do you want to go? And yeah, an openness to always changing too, because things don't go as planned.
No, they never do. And things are going to change whether you like it or not, right? So like, I think that's a great point as well, is to like, even if you have some sense of a direction, like it could be loose. In 5 years, it could be totally different. But I still think, you know, like following that instinct and like taking the path that you think is right, even if it leads you towards a totally different thing, is probably the right way to go, right? It's like you still have to kind of trust those instincts and know that they will change at some point as well. Jess, I think we're going to slowly wrap things up here. We hit the hour mark. It went by very quickly. Is there anything you'd like to add or say or, I don't know, like contribute before we sign off? I don't know if there's something you really wanted to get out there.
No, I think we touched on a lot of those things for me, honestly. It feels very spot on for the things I like to talk about and the things I care about. I don't know. Can you, like, is there anything else you wanted to cover or touch on? Anything you need, like sound bites or anything?
No, not at all. Not at all, honestly. And I also like this approach of taking it more conversationally with the podcast, and like I don't try and over prepare too much, because like I like getting into the weeds sometimes, or like, you know, finding our way towards a topic that we may not have gotten to if it was just like question after question after question. So in that regard, I feel very set. I feel like it was a great, and we talked about some like stuff that I'm really passionate about and interested in, and like I was happy to hear your opinion as well. So yeah, nothing that I can think of. Yeah, I just want to thank you again for agreeing to do this and joining me for this conversation. Yeah, maybe sometime we'll do another one too, or if I'm ever in LA, I'll let you know. Would love to come and see your studio at some point. It looks beautiful.
I'd love to have you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you.